By the mid-1970s, the Tonka plant in Mound, Minnesota employed over 2,000 workers on a site stretching a third of a mile along Lake Minnetonka. They stamped 13 to 16 million toy trucks per year, more vehicles than Detroit. 90% of American households owned at least one, built from the same automotive steel they put in Chevrolets, heavy enough to survive a real elephant standing on one in a television commercial. Then, piece by piece, it came apart. A new CEO who concluded the Minnesota factory was uncompetitive, a closure in December 1983, 8 years before Hasbro arrived. A $555 million acquisition financed with junk bonds at 17% interest. A bankruptcy? A sale at a discount? The factory makes doors and screens now. The groundwater carries poison toward the lake. A museum preserves what's left. 400 trucks in display cases. $3 suggested donation within sight of where they were made. This is the story of how three men in a schoolhouse built something that defined American childhood, and how the decisions accumulated until the steel became plastic, and the plastic moved to China. The trucks survived. They were built to last. The company that made them wasn't. The story begins in a four-room schoolhouse on Linwood Boulevard in a lakeside village called Mound, Minnesota, 20 miles west of Minneapolis, on the shores of Lake Minnetonka, population roughly 2,000. The kind of place where everybody knew everybody, where the lake froze thick enough to drive on by January, and where a man could start a business in a converted schoolroom without anyone thinking it's strange. September 18th, 1946. Three men filed incorporation papers for something called Mound Metalcraft. They'd pooled their savings, bought the schoolhouse from a lumber company that had given up on toy making, and set out to manufacture metal tie racks and garden tools. The tie racks were forgettable. That's the word historians would use decades later, forgettable. What those three men didn't know yet was that in the corner of their newly purchased schoolhouse sat a pile of wooden toy prototypes that would make them famous, and that the forgettable tie racks would become a footnote to an empire. Lynn Everett Baker was 47 years old when he signed those papers. A University of Minnesota graduate, he'd spent his working life selling used cars in Minneapolis, running a dealership called Tri-Motor Company. He understood how to move product, how to read a customer, how to close. He'd be president of Mound Metalcraft, handling sales. Avery Crounce, 56, had been Baker's partner at Tri-Motor. He was the numbers man, the one who made the books balance, who knew where every dollar went and whether it was coming back. He'd handle finances. The third founder was different from the other two. Alvin Tesh was just 31 years old, a pressed metal craftsman who'd spent the war years at Northern Pump, a Minneapolis defense contractor. The company's official history would describe him only as intimately involved with certain developments for the Navy. The kind of language that meant classified work, the kind of work that taught a man what metal could do under pressure. Crounce had recruited Tesh specifically for what he knew how to do with his hands. We tell the stories of what America built and how it fell apart. If that's your thing, subscribe. More of these are coming. Now let's get back to the story. Baker and Crounce shared a past that would have disqualified most men from the toy business. During a 1935 labor dispute at their car dealership, striking union workers shot Baker through the hand. In the melee that followed, Crounce shot 3 people. Both men were beaten by the crowd until Minneapolis police pulled them out. The newspaper accounts are vivid and ugly. A decade later, those same 2 men were standing in a schoolhouse, planning to make toys for children. America has always been a country where reinvention is possible. The schoolhouse had belonged to the L.E. Streeter Company, a lumberyard chain that had diversified into kitchen cabinets during the Depression and ammunition boxes during the war. Edward Streeter, the founder's son, had tried something clever with his surplus materials. Using leftover ammunition box wood and recycled meat cans, he'd built 2 toy prototypes, a steam shovel numbered 100 and a crane, with a clamshell bucket numbered 150. The designs were sound. The proportions looked right. The mechanisms actually worked. Streeter had debuted his wooden toys at the 1946 New York Toy Fair, confident that buyers would see what he saw. They didn't. The reception was tepid, the orders thin. Streeter decided toys weren't his future, and sold Baker and Krauss the building, the patents, the tooling, and the unsold prototypes for whatever sum the papers recorded. The prototypes went with the deal. They sat in the corner while the new owners focused on tie racks and garden tools, gathering the dust of abandoned ideas. It was Alvin Tesh, the metalworker, who saw what Streeter had missed. Tesh started examining those wooden prototypes the way a surgeon studies an x-ray. He'd pick them up, turn them over, work the mechanisms. The designs were sound, Streeter's proportions were right, the engineering was solid, but wood was the wrong material entirely. Wood splintered. Wood cracked at the joints. Wood didn't survive a Minnesota winter, and it certainly didn't survive a child who actually played with his toys. A wooden truck in a sandbox would last one season, maybe two. What Tesh understood, what his years at Northern Pump had taught him, was that the right material changes everything. 20-gauge automotive steel, the same grade they stamped into car doors and fenders and hoods. The war had ended and the steel mills were swimming in surplus, looking for civilian markets for metal that had been destined for tanks and ships. You could buy the stuff cheap, and steel, properly formed, would last forever. Tesh recruited the designer who'd created Streeter's original toys. Charles Grosjean was just 25 years old in 1947, but he had a habit that would serve Tonka well for decades. He didn't guess what construction equipment looked like. He visited real construction sites, he studied real fire trucks at actual fire departments, he measured, photographed, sketched. When Grosjean designed a toy truck, it looked like the real thing because he'd stood next to the real thing with a notebook. Together, Tesh and Grosjean redesigned the steam shovel and crane in metal. They replaced the recycled meat cans and ammunition box wood with stamped steel components that clicked together with mechanical precision. They painted the toys bright yellow, the color of Caterpillar equipment, the color that said construction to any American child who'd watched a building go up. The prototypes were heavy in the hand. That was the point. A child doesn't want a toy that feels like a toy. A child wants a truck that feels like a truck. Solid, substantial, real. Lynn Baker explained the philosophy to the Minneapolis Tribune in 1953. A youngster really had to use his imagination with the toys on the market. We decided to make scale model miniatures that looked just like the trucks a little boy might see passing his house every day. Every day. The trucks passing the house. The bulldozers reshaping the lot next door. The dump trucks hauling dirt to the new development. Baker understood something essential about children and desire. They don't want fantasy. They want to hold the world they see, scaled down to fit their hands. The 1947 New York Toy Fair was Tonka's first test. Tesh and Baker brought the steel prototypes to the same venue where Streeter's wooden versions had failed a year earlier. The same buyers who had shrugged at wood placed orders for steel. The entire first-year production run, 37,000 units, sold out within months. The tie racks and garden tools were quietly abandoned, never to be mentioned in company histories again. They needed a brand name. Someone, the records don't specify who, suggested Tonka, derived from Tonka, a Dakota Sioux word meaning great or big. Lake Minnetonka, the body of water that defined their corner of Minnesota, carried the same root. The name honored the place where the toys were born. A University of Minnesota drafting student named Donald Olson sketched a logo, the word Tonka Toys, above stylized blue waves, with 3 seagulls soaring overhead, one for each founder. Another designer, Erling Eckloff, refined the image. The logo would evolve over the decades, but the name never changed. Legally, the company remained Mound Metalcraft until November 23, 1955, when the corporate name finally caught up to the brand. But from the very first steel truck, from that first sell-out production run, the toys carried the Tonka name. Vanita Tesh, Alvin's daughter, remembered the early years in a first-hand account she provided decades later. In 1946, our family moved from Minneapolis to a house on Lake Independence, she wrote. The early years were pretty lean. Lean. The word carries more weight than it might seem. A startup burning through capital, orders coming faster than production could meet, the constant pressure to expand before the competition caught up. Vanita remembered her father bringing home turkeys for her mother Louise to cook and serve at the plant's holiday dinners, the founder's wife in the kitchen, feeding the workers who were building something that mattered. By 1949, Mound Metalcraft employed 215 workers across 3 shifts. The schoolhouse that had failed at toy making under Streeter was now genuinely in the toy business. That year, they introduced their first dump truck, the product category that would define Tonka for 50 years. The transformation had taken less than 3 years. 3 men, a schoolhouse, a pile of rejected wooden prototypes, and the insight that steel changes everything. The 1950s were the years when America rebuilt itself, and Tonka grew alongside the machinery doing the rebuilding. Dwight Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act in 1956, authorizing 41,000 miles of interstate highways at a cost that would eventually exceed $400 billion. The largest public works project in human history required the largest movement of earth in human history. Bulldozers, graders, scrapers, dump trucks, yellow machines crawled across the American landscape from coast to coast, reshaping the continent into something a car could cross in days instead of weeks. Every child in America could see those machines. They watched from sidewalks and backyards and car windows as the equipment growled past, pushing dirt, hauling fill, laying the foundation for the suburbs that would define post-war life. And at the toy store, at the department store, under the Christmas tree, Tonka gave them those machines in miniature. The 4-room schoolhouse couldn't hold the operation anymore. In 1955, they broke ground on a purpose-built manufacturing facility on Shoreline Road, overlooking Lake Minnetonka. The new plant stretched a third of a mile along the lakeshore, so large you could see it from the water, so significant that the town erected signs at the entrance. Welcome to the trucking capital of the world. The founding trio didn't survive the decade intact. In 1952, the board considered a proposal to relocate operations to Tennessee, chasing tax incentives. When the board rejected the move, something fractured. Crounce and Tesh left the company, the exact circumstances lost to time, the disagreements unrecorded. Crounce died in 1960. Baker departed in 1961, his health failing, and died in 1964 without seeing what Tonka would become. Leadership passed to men who had risen from within. Gordon Batdorf had joined as a bookkeeper in 1946, the same year the company incorporated. He'd flown P-47 Thunderbolts in the war, one of the heavy single-engine fighters that dominated the European theater. But when he came home to Minnesota, he took a job balancing Mound Metalcraft's books. He learned the business from the floor up: production schedules, material costs, shipping logistics, labor relations. By 1964, he was president. Badorf was known for a particular habit that defined his management style. He required everyone on the factory floor to wear name tags, not employee numbers, names. When Gordon Badorf walked through the plant, he addressed workers by their first names. In a factory that would eventually employ over 2,000 people, that kind of personal recognition meant something. The Christmas parties he threw became legendary. Lavish by small-town Minnesota standards, they featured food and entertainment, and the detail everyone remembered: a wrapped gift for every employee's child, selected by age group, handed out personally by management. The parties weren't charity, they were relationship building, the deliberate cultivation of loyalty in a workforce that management needed to keep. Russell Wengstern had been an industrial arts teacher at Mound High School before joining Tonka. He understood manufacturing as craft, not just process. He rose to become co-manager, then CEO, providing the operational discipline that complemented Badorf's relationship skills. Between the two of them, Tonka had the leadership it needed for the expansion ahead. The product line grew methodically. Dump trucks, cranes, front loaders, fire engines. Each model underwent the same design philosophy Grosjean had established: study the real equipment, capture the proportions, engineer the mechanisms to work. A Tonka crane didn't just look like a crane. The boom extended, the bucket closed, the cable wound. A child could do real work in a miniature. In 1964, the design team began working on something larger than anything they'd attempted. Lee Filesticker, Ron Pauley, and Ted Zbikowski, the model makers who translated concepts into prototypes, collaborated with Grosjean on what would become the company's defining product. They borrowed details from everywhere. The cab silhouette came from a haul pack, the heavy haulers used in open pit mines. The vertical lights came from a 1963 Caterpillar 769. The three holes in the bumper came from Crane Carrier Company trucks. Grosjean reportedly studied photographs of real dump trucks working South American pit mines to get the scale right. What emerged was the mighty Tonka dump truck, 19 inches long, 11 pounds of steel, rubber, and paint, tires nearly 5 inches in diameter, the bed tilted up on a real hinge mechanism. The cab door opened. The whole thing felt less like a toy than like a piece of equipment that had somehow shrunk. Retail price, $4.99. The mighty dump arrived in stores in 1965, and the toy truck market was never the same. Picture the morning shift arriving at Shoreline Road in 1972. The parking lot fills before 7, hundreds of cars streaming in from every direction, from Mound itself and from the farm towns scattered across the lake country. Lester Prairie, Waconia, Watertown, Delano. Some workers carpool 5 or 6 to a vehicle, driving 30 or 40 miles each way, because the jobs at Tonka are worth the commute. The early light off Lake Minnetonka is silver and flat at that hour, the water still, the sky just beginning to color. The plant looms on the shoreline, a third of a mile of industrial architecture, built for a purpose you can feel before you walk through the doors. The first thing that hits you is the sound. Not one sound, but dozens layered into a single wall of mechanical noise. The stamping presses set the rhythm, a bass note crash every few seconds as dies meet steel. A heartbeat you feel through your boot soles before you hear it with your ears. Underneath that, the hiss of pneumatic tools, the clatter of parts moving down conveyor belts, the whine of electric motors, the specific metallic ping of stamped components landing in bins. The plant doesn't stop during operating hours. The rhythm doesn't pause. If you've never been inside a working factory, you might expect gaps, moments of quiet. There aren't any. The sound is continuous, a roar that becomes white noise after the first hour, something you stop consciously hearing even as it shapes everything around you. The smell comes next, machine oil first, the lubricant on every moving part, a petroleum sweetness that seeps into your clothes and hair. Then the paint line, fresh enamel, that bright yellow that every American child would recognize. There's a specific chemical sharpness to industrial paint, somewhere between sweet and astringent, that you never forget once you've worked around it. Underneath those dominant notes, subtler ones, metal shavings with their particular iron tang, hydraulic fluid, the degreasing solvent called trichloroethylene, a chlorinated smell, sharp and medicinal, used to clean oil from steel components before painting. The workers didn't know then that TCE would contaminate the groundwater for decades. They knew the smell, that's all. It was part of the job. The workflow was elegant in its industrial simplicity. Sheets of cold-rolled automotive steel came in one end of the plant, 20 gauge, the same grade they stamped into Chevrolets and Fords. Coils weighing thousands of pounds fed into shearing machines that cut the steel into blanks. Blanks fed into stamping presses fitted with progressive dies. Massive precision tools, some of them 10 feet long, eventually costing hundreds of thousands of dollars to engineer and build. Each press stroke bent and cut and formed the steel into components: a truck bed, a cab, a bumper, a chassis, a wheel well. The components moved to the paint line. Yellow enamel, that trademark bright yellow, went on in even coats, dried under heat, emerged gleaming. Other colors for specialty models: red for fire trucks, green for farm equipment, white for utility vehicles. But yellow was the default. Yellow was Tonka. Yellow was what children asked for by name. Painted parts moved to assembly. Workers fitted axles, attached wheels, secured accessories. Each truck required a specific sequence of operations, each operation performed by hands that had done the same motions thousands of times. The women on the line moved with a precision that looked effortless and wasn't, reaching for parts without looking, fitting components together in rhythms worn smooth by repetition. Lloyd Lauman knew every station on that line. He'd started in 1955, fresh out of Waconia High School, hired to package finished toys for shipping. Entry level, lowest rung. Over the years, he'd worked his way through the plant, assembly, quality control, supervision, Management. By the 1970s, he was vice president of manufacturing, and he could still walk the floor and point to the exact spot where he'd stood on his first day. The women who worked those assembly stations came from the small towns scattered around Lake Minnetonka. Tonka hired predominantly housewives, a deliberate labor strategy. Rural women looking for income while their children were in school. Women who weren't unionized, who weren't organizing, who would work for wages that kept Tonka competitive against companies in lower cost regions. Susan Alberts of Lester Prairie supervised the line for 6 years. She made the commute every day, one of 5 or 6 women in a carpool, leaving before her children woke, returning after they got home from school. Who wouldn't enjoy making toys, she said later, and the question wasn't rhetorical. There was genuine pleasure in the work. Not the abstract pleasure of theory, but the tangible satisfaction of building something solid, something you could hold in your hands, something with weight and heft and substance. The trucks that came off that line would outlast the workers who built them. Everyone on that floor knew it. You could pick up a finished mighty dump, feel the 11 pounds of steel, and know that a child somewhere would beat on that truck for years, and it would survive every minute of it. At peak production, the plant pushed out over 300,000 toys per week, 50,000 per day, hundreds every hour. The parking lot that filled before 7 emptied after 3, and the afternoon shift took over, and the machines kept running. By the late 1960s, Tonka wasn't just Mound's largest employer. Tonka was the reason Mound existed in the form it did. The plant shaped everything. The bars where workers drank after their shifts, the diners where they ate lunch, the churches where they worshiped on Sundays, the Little League teams their children played on, the schools those children attended, schools funded by the property taxes that Tonka's payroll made possible. The Westonka Historical Society would document it simply. Everyone knew at least someone who worked for Tonka, and many had one or more family members that were employed there. It wasn't an exaggeration. Fathers and sons worked the same shifts. Mothers and daughters ran adjacent stations on the assembly line. Families where 3 generations had punched the same time clock, walked through the same gates, parked in the same lot. The factory was inheritance, not in the legal sense, but in the social one. A job at Tonka wasn't just employment. It was membership in something larger than yourself. Ron Pauley joined as a model maker in 1965. He was a member of Sheet Metal Workers Local 34, one of the skilled tradespeople who belonged to unions even though the production floor didn't. That distinction was deliberate. Management had built a workforce of farm wives precisely because they weren't organized, and labor costs stayed manageable as a result. But the absence of a union didn't mean the absence of pride or loyalty, or the sense that Tonka was worth something beyond the paycheck. The Christmas parties weren't just corporate generosity. They were institutional bonding, management's deliberate cultivation of the kind of workforce attachment that transcends wages. Gordon Badorf walked through the party greeting workers by name, remembering their children, asking about their families. The gifts for employees' children were selected individually, not pulled at random from a bin. The message was clear: we see you, we know you, you matter here. In 1969, a survey found that over 90% of American households owned at least one Tonka toy. 90%. That number is almost impossible to achieve in any product category. Coca-Cola doesn't hit 90% of households. Most automakers don't hit 90% of households. Tonka did. The average American home contained 5.4 Tonka toys. Not one dump truck gathering dust in a closet. More than 5 DAWs. Dump trucks and fire engines and front loaders and cranes, accumulating in sandboxes and basements and toy chests, handed down from older siblings to younger ones, inherited from cousins, surviving abuse that would destroy any other toy on the market. The advertising made durability the selling point. The most famous commercial came sometime around 1972, a real elephant stepping on a mighty dump truck. The animal's foot came down on the yellow steel, the full weight of an elephant concentrated on a toy truck, and the truck didn't crush. The tagline landed like a dare: a toy shouldn't break just because a child plays with it. When skeptics suggested the footage was faked, Tonka filmed a follow-up commercial showing the outtakes, the behind-the-scenes reality of the elephant stepping on truck after truck. Real elephants, real trucks, real survival. Another spot pushed the point further. A full-size dump truck and a Tonka Mighty Dump were both pushed off a cliff. The real truck, the one built for adult work, the one that cost thousands of dollars, crumpled on impact. The toy survived. The message was unmistakable. These weren't toys pretending to be trucks. These were trucks that happened to be small. Detroit, move over for Mound, Minnesota. The boast wasn't entirely a joke. By the mid-1970s, Tonka was producing more vehicles per year than the American auto industry. 13 to 16 million units annually, rolling off the lines in 3 shifts, 6 days a week. In pure unit volume, not value, not revenue, but number of vehicles manufactured, this lakeside town 20 miles from Minneapolis genuinely was the trucking capital of the world. The product catalog had expanded to 125 different models. The Mighty line alone included the clam, the crane, the shovel, the scraper, the bulldozer, the T9, modeled after a Caterpillar D9, the wrecker, the mixer, the front loader, and eventually the mighty Winnebago for children who dreamed of the open road. The plant consumed 5 to 6 million pounds of steel annually for the mighty dump alone. Another 15 to 17 million pounds fed the rest of the line. Facilities in 8 countries carried the Tonka name. Michelle Parnett Dwyer, a curator at the Strong National Museum of Play, would summarize the era in a single sentence. No one could really compete with that back then. In 1975, a man named Donald Lynn Dwyer hosted a factory tour video, playing a character called Roundhouse Rodney. He walked visitors through the plant, explaining each station, showing the journey from steel sheet to finished toy. The video captured the daily reality, the noise, the motion, the coordinated chaos of a factory running at capacity. Dwyer died the following year. The video survived, preserved by the West Donka Historical Society, a window into a world that was already closer to its end than anyone working those lines would have believed. The numbers from 1974 and 1975 tell the story of an empire at its apex. Revenue, $102 million. Employment, over 2,000 workers at the Mound plant alone. Annual production, 13 to 16 million toy trucks. Let those production numbers settle for a moment. 16 million vehicles, 325,000 per week, over 50,000 per day. Every minute the plant was running, another small fleet of yellow trucks moved toward loading docks, toward distribution centers, toward toy stores and department stores and Christmas mornings across the country. Tonka was the largest manufacturer of toy trucks in the world. The largest. Not in America, in the world. A company that had started in a 4-room schoolhouse less than 30 years earlier now dominated a global category. And Mound, Minnesota, population still under 8,000, was genuinely, not metaphorically, the place where more trucks were built than anywhere else on Earth. The annual reports from those years project absolute confidence. Production efficiency was improving year over year. The mighty line was expanding into new categories. International operations were growing steadily. The company had survived recessions and material shortages, and 2 decades of competition from companies that wanted what Tonka had built. The formula worked. Build the truck like you mean it. Price it fairly. Let the quality speak for itself. In 2001, the mighty dump truck would be inducted into the National Toy Hall of Fame, recognition that the product had become part of American childhood itself, as fundamental to the sandbox as the sand. But standing at the summit, no one at Tonka could see what was gathering below the horizon. Japanese electronics companies were building consumer products that American manufacturers couldn't match on price or features. The first video game consoles, Atari, Magnavox Odyssey, were appearing in living rooms, teaching children that entertainment could happen on a screen instead of in a backyard. The generation that had begged for Tonka trucks was growing into teenagers who wanted something electronic, something that moved without their hands touching it. Offshore manufacturers in Asia were learning to make toys at price points Tonka couldn't touch. Not steel toys, not built-to-last toys, but plastic toys, bright, cheap, disposable. The market was shifting under everyone's feet toward lower prices, toward planned obsolescence, toward products designed to be replaced rather than inherited. The first plastic components had already appeared in Tonka trucks. Wheels that had been rubber were now plastic. Some accessories that had been steel were now molded polymer. The changes were small, incremental, nearly invisible to consumers. They were also the beginning of something that couldn't be stopped. None of this was visible from the Shoreline Road plant in 1975. The presses were crashing in their rhythm. The trucks were selling as fast as the line could make them. The Christmas party planning was already underway. That was the summit, the highest point before the fall. The workers driving home from the night shift, headlights sweeping across the parking lot, didn't know that the peak they were living through was already the past tense of a story that would end badly. They had no reason to think that everything they'd built together, those millions of trucks that would outlast their children's childhoods, was about to start coming apart. The machines were still running. The steel was still flowing. The paint was still yellow, still bright, still the color of something that was supposed to last forever. The trouble didn't announce itself. It accumulated quietly, in conference rooms and balance sheets, in numbers that only became visible when someone bothered to look closely at the trend lines instead of the quarterly reports. Tonka's market share for toy trucks, the category they had dominated for a generation, the category they had essentially invented in its modern form, began eroding through the mid-1970s, not collapsing, eroding. A percentage point here, a percentage point there. The kind of decline that looks like statistical noise in any single quarter and looks like a death sentence only in retrospect. The competitors who were taking that share weren't trying to match Tonka on quality. They had learned somewhere along the way that they didn't have to. A company in Hong Kong or Taiwan could manufacture a plastic dump truck for a fraction of what it cost to stamp one from automotive steel in Minnesota. The plastic truck wouldn't survive an elephant stepping on it. It wouldn't last a generation, but it would last long enough. Long enough for a birthday party, long enough for a Christmas morning, long enough for the attention span of a child who would forget the toy existed by Easter and want something entirely different by summer. In a toy store aisle, when a parent stood between an $11 Mighty Dump and a $4 plastic imitation, price often won. The parent knew that Tonka was better. The parent could feel the difference in weight, in heft, in the obvious quality of the construction. But $4 was $4, and children outgrow toys, and maybe the cheaper one would be fine. Planned obsolescence had arrived in the toy industry. Build it cheap, sell it cheap, let it break, sell another one. The business model that had transformed consumer electronics was now transforming toys, and Tonka's entire identity, the elephant commercial, the trucks that lasted generations, the promise that quality justified the price, was built on the opposite principle. Something else was shifting beneath the market, something harder to see but ultimately more devastating. The first video game consoles had appeared in American living rooms. Atari launched the 2600 in 1977. Magnavox had the Odyssey. The screens that would eventually reshape childhood itself were blinking to life in dens and basements across the country. The children who had begged for Tonka trucks at age 5 were growing into teenagers who wanted Pong, who wanted Space Invaders, who wanted Pac-Man. They wanted entertainment that moved without their hands touching it, entertainment that happened on a screen, entertainment that was new in ways a yellow dump truck could never be. The sandbox was losing to the television. Nobody at Tonka had a strategy for competing with a screen. Nobody in Mound, Minnesota was developing video games. The company tried diversification instead. They had never successfully launched a staple line of girls' toys. The market was dominated by Mattel's Barbie, a cultural phenomenon that had been generating revenue since 1959. Tonka's expertise was in construction equipment, in heavy machinery, in the masculine world of building and hauling. Dolls were a different business entirely. In 1973, management acquired Vogue Dolls, hoping to buy their way into the category. The acquisition solved nothing. Vogue was a minor player with minor market share. Tonka's executives didn't know how to market dolls, didn't know how to compete with Mattel's advertising machine, didn't know the first thing about a customer base they had never cultivated. They tried other diversifications. Mel Manufacturing, a barbecue grill company, had been acquired back in 1964. Now they added hydraulic components, educational products, ceramic glazes. Each acquisition made sense on paper, in the conference room logic of spreading risk and finding new revenue streams. Each acquisition diluted focus. The company that had succeeded by doing one thing brilliantly, building toy trucks that were actually built to last, was now spreading itself across businesses it didn't understand, managed by executives who had never made a grill or a glaze in their lives. The core business kept eroding. The diversifications didn't compensate. In 1978, facing flat sales and shrinking margins, management made a decision born of desperation. They would launch 70 new products simultaneously. 70 in a single year. For a company whose competitive advantage had always been precision, quality, the methodical perfection of a limited product line, 70 new products was an impossible burden. Each new item required new tooling, those progressive dies that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to engineer. Each required new training for assembly workers. Each required new quality control procedures, new packaging, new marketing materials, new shelf space negotiations with retailers. The production lines that had run smoothly for decades suddenly choked on complexity. The workers who had spent years perfecting the mighty dump were now trying to build dozens of unfamiliar products with unfamiliar processes. Bugs multiplied, costs soared, deadlines slipped. Quality began to slip too. The one thing Tonka could never afford to lose, the promise that their toys were better, tougher, more durable than anything else on the market. The promise that justified the premium price started to erode along with everything else. The company ended 1978 in the red. For the first time in institutional memory, for the first time since those lean early years in the schoolhouse, Tonka Corporation lost money. The board knew something had to change. They brought in a new leader. Stephen Shank arrived as CEO in 1979. He was approximately 40 years old, Harvard Law School graduate, former attorney at Dorsey and Whitney, the white shoe Minneapolis firm that represented the state's largest corporations, the firm where ambitious young lawyers learned how deals were structured and how power was wielded. Shank wasn't a toy man. He had never run a production line, never walked a factory floor as an hourly employee, never felt the particular satisfaction of building something physical with his hands. He was a strategist, a deal maker, a numbers man who understood leverage and consolidation and competitive positioning in ways that the founders of Tonka, the car dealers and the metalworker and the industrial arts teacher, never had. The Wall Street Transcript would twice name him the toy industry's most outstanding CEO. The financial press admired his discipline, his willingness to make hard choices, his refusal to be sentimental about assets that weren't performing. He was brilliant, he was aggressive, he was willing to make decisions that the men who had built Tonka would never have contemplated. Shank looked at the Mound plant and saw a problem that needed solving. The facility was aging. The stamping presses that had seemed state-of-the-art in 1955 were now approaching 30 years old. The paint lines needed constant maintenance. The physical infrastructure required investment that would never show up as revenue, only as avoided catastrophe. The workforce was relatively expensive. Not unionized, Tonka had been careful about that from the beginning, hiring farm wives instead of industrial workers, building a culture of loyalty instead of confrontation. But not cheap either. These were people who had spent years, sometimes decades, perfecting their craft. They expected wages commensurate with their skills. They lived in communities around Minneapolis where the cost of living wasn't negligible. The location made no logistical sense for a company competing in a global market. 20 miles from Minneapolis on the shore of a lake, accessible primarily by a single road, the raw materials, the steel, the paint, the rubber, the packaging, came from somewhere else and had to be trucked in. The finished products shipped to somewhere else and had to be trucked out. Everything about the geography added cost without adding value. Shank ran the numbers. He compared Tonka's cost structure to competitors manufacturing in Mexico, in Taiwan, in Hong Kong, in places where labor cost a fraction of what it cost in Minnesota, where environmental regulations were suggestions rather than requirements, where the social contract between company and community simply didn't exist. He concluded that Mound was uncompetitive. The spreadsheet said so. The analysis said so. The math was the math. In 1983, Shank hired 4 former Mattel executives to modernize operations. Mattel was the industry giant. The company that had built Barbie into a billion-dollar brand. The company that understood mass manufacturing and international supply chains, and the ruthless economics of competing in a globalized toy market. Their executives knew things that Tonka's homegrown management didn't know. One of those executives, a vice president of sales and marketing, reportedly delivered an assessment that would have been heresy a decade earlier. That would have been unthinkable in the era of Gordon Badorf and the name tags and the Christmas parties. Tonka was building toys too tough. The trucks didn't need to last a generation. The trucks didn't need to survive an elephant. The trucks needed to last maybe 2 years. Long enough for a child to play with them, short enough that parents would need to buy replacements. The durability that had defined Tonka, that had been the core of every advertisement and every promise, was actually a business liability. Every truck that survived a decade in a sandbox was a truck that didn't need to be replaced. Every truck handed down from an older sibling to a younger one was a sale that never happened. Build them to break. Build them to be replaced. Build them to fit a market that had stopped valuing permanence. Stephen Shank made his decision. Production would move to El Paso, Texas, and across the border to Juarez, Mexico. Labor costs were dramatically lower. The logistics were simpler, closer to the ports, closer to the suppliers who were increasingly located in Asia. The entire supply chain could be restructured to reduce overhead at every stage. 40% of manufacturing would be outsourced to external suppliers, companies Tonka didn't own, workers Tonka had never met, facilities Tonka had never inspected. The vertical integration that had been a source of quality control would become a source of cost. The Mound plant, the factory that had stretched a third of a mile along the lakeshore, the place where 2,000 workers had built the trucking capital of the world, the facility that had welcomed children on school tours and thrown Christmas parties for employees' families, would close. The announcement came in 1983. The last day of production would be December 9th, a Monday. Lloyd Lauman was still vice president of manufacturing. He had started on the assembly line in 1955, packaging finished toys for shipping, the lowest rung on the ladder. He had risen through every level of the operation, assembly, quality control, supervision, management, until he understood the Mound plant the way a captain understands a ship. Now he walked through the plant in its final weeks, watching the machinery slow. The orders were winding down. The progressive dies that had cost hundreds of thousands of dollars sat idle for longer stretches each day. Workers who had known each other for decades, who had carpooled together, whose children had played together, who had stood beside each other at union halls and church pews and Friday fish fries, were cleaning out lockers, collecting personal items, saying goodbyes that felt like something heavier than goodbyes. Lauman wrote about it in the company newsletter. His words survived because someone thought they were worth keeping. A state of depression setting in around the factory. Every day I'd walk through the plant and I'd wonder what's going to happen to this person, or this person, that person. The women who had carpooled from Lester Prairie and Waconia and Watertown, driving 40 miles each way for jobs that had seemed permanent. The skilled tradespeople who had spent careers perfecting the dies and tooling, whose expertise existed nowhere on paper, only in their hands. The line supervisors like Susan Alberts, who had built small kingdoms of competence and loyalty over years of daily work. Approximately 500 people lost their jobs when the Mound plant closed. The company offered them positions in El Paso. Tonka followed the proper procedures, made the offer officially, extended relocation assistance to anyone willing to move 1,000 miles south to a border city where they knew no one, where the landscape was desert instead of lakes, where everything they had built their lives around would be a memory. Almost no one took it. The historical record is explicit. Very few workers accepted the offer to relocate. These were people rooted in Minnesota, in the lakes and the farms and the Lutheran churches and the small towns where their families had lived for generations. The job offer came with an impossible condition attached: abandon everything else you know. On December 9th, 1983, the last steel truck rolled off the Mound production line. Someone watched it go. Someone, the records don't preserve who, must have stood there as the final product moved through the final station, yellow and heavy and perfect, built the way Tonka trucks had always been built. Then the line stopped. The presses went silent. The lights went dark in sections of the factory that had never been dark during operating hours. not in nearly 40 years. The trucking capital of the world had surrendered its title 8 years before Hasbro ever entered the picture. Stephen Shank's cost cuts worked, at least by the metrics that Wall Street cared about. The El Paso and Juarez operations ran cheaper than Minnesota ever could. Mexican labor cost a fraction of American labor. The outsourcing reduced fixed costs. The balance sheet stabilized. Profitability returned. The stock price recovered. The analysts wrote favorable reports. The Wall Street transcript gave Shank his awards. Then came the products that briefly made everything look like genius. GoBots launched in 1984. The concept came from Japan, licensed from a company called Bandai. Transforming robots, vehicles that folded and twisted and reconfigured into humanoid warriors. Cars became fighters. Jets became heroes. Trucks became giant metal soldiers. The toys tapped into something primal. Children had always animated their vehicles, had always imagined their trucks as characters with personalities and missions. GoBots made the transformation literal. The toy didn't just represent a vehicle. The toy became something else. First-year sales, $100 million. A category Tonka hadn't been in 12 months earlier, was suddenly generating 9 figures in revenue. The yellow steel dump trucks that had built the company were still selling, still profitable, but GoBots was the growth story. GoBots was what the analysts wanted to discuss. Pound puppies arrived in 1985, plush dogs with sad eyes and floppy ears. Each one came with an adoption certificate. Each one was a unique rescue that children could nurture and name and love. The toys bypassed the usual play patterns, construction, competition, action, and went straight for the emotional core. Children didn't play with pound puppies. Children cared for them. The phenomenon was immediate and massive. By 1986, pound puppies accounted for more than half of Tonka's profits. Revenue doubled from $146 million in 1984 to $293 million in 1987. The numbers looked like resurrection. They looked like vindication. They looked like proof that Stephen Shank had been right to close the Mound plant, right to restructure, right to transform Tonka from a steel truck manufacturer into a diversified toy company that could ride whatever wave came next. The numbers were a trap. GoBots and pound puppies were fads. The word carried a warning that everyone in the toy industry understood. Fads spike and crash. They don't build sustainable businesses. They build dependencies on the next spike, the next phenomenon, the next toy that captures children's attention for 18 months before they move on to whatever comes after. GoBots got crushed. Hasbro had its own transforming robot line. Transformers, also licensed from a Japanese company, also featuring vehicles that became warriors. But Hasbro understood something Tonka didn't. Hasbro understood that toys in the 1980s needed television. The Transformers animated series debuted in September 1984. It ran for 4 seasons and a theatrical movie. Every episode was, in effect, a commercial, showing children the characters, the mythology, the story they could continue with the toys. GoBots had products, Transformers had a universe. By 1986, GoBots was dying. The $100 million phenomenon had become a clearance bin casualty, stacked in discount stores, while Transformers dominated every shelf at full price. Pound puppies crashed in 1987. The collapse wasn't gradual. Fads don't fade, they end. One season the toys were everywhere, in every store, under every Christmas tree. The next season they were piling up in warehouses, their adoption certificates going unsigned, their sad button eyes staring at nobody. Profits dropped roughly 70% in the first half of 1987. The plush dogs that had carried the company were suddenly unsellable. Tonka was on a treadmill now. The base business, the steel trucks, the construction toys, the products that had built the company couldn't support the overhead alone. Management needed the next fad to survive. They needed to find it before the cash ran out. Stephen Shank believed he understood the solution. The problem wasn't execution. The problem was scale. The toy industry was consolidating. The economics of television advertising, retail shelf space, movie licensing, and international distribution all favored size. Small companies were being absorbed by larger ones. The future belonged to giants who could afford Super Bowl commercials and Hollywood partnerships, and distribution networks that reached every country on Earth. Schenck calculated that a toy company needed $500 million in annual revenue to survive what was coming. Tonka was at $300 million. The gap was $200 million, too large to grow into organically, too important to ignore. In the summer of 1987, an opportunity appeared. New World Entertainment, a company known primarily for B-movies and television syndication, launched a hostile takeover of Kenner Parker Toys. The bid was $47 per share. The Kenner Parker board didn't want to sell to New World. They were looking for alternatives. Stephen Schenck saw his chance. Kenner Parker was everything Tonka wasn't. They had Monopoly, the best-selling board game in history, a product that had been generating revenue since 1935. They had Risk and Clue and Trivial Pursuit. They had Play-Doh, the modeling compound that had been in American homes since the 1950s. They had Nerf, the foam sports equipment that had created an entire product category. They had Care Bears. They had the Ghostbusters toy line, riding the success of the blockbuster film franchise. If Tonka acquired Kenner Parker, they would vault past Schenck's $500 million threshold overnight. They would become the third largest toy company in America, behind only Hasbro and Mattel. They would have the scale to survive. Schenck came in as a white knight. He offered $51 per share, $4 higher than New World's hostile bid. The Kenner Parker board accepted gratefully. The deal closed on October 16, 1987. The price was approximately $555 million. Tonka didn't have $555 million. Tonka had never come close to having $555 million. The entire company had generated $293 million in revenue the previous year. They borrowed nearly everything. $250 million came from a bank syndicate led by First National Bank of Chicago. This was senior secured debt, the relatively safe kind, backed by assets, carrying reasonable interest rates. The rest came from junk bonds. Two separate issues. High-yield debt, the polite term for borrowing that traditional lenders won't touch. Interest rates of 16.25% on one issue, interest rates of 17.25% on the other. 16%, 17%, compounding annually, due regardless of whether the toys sold or sat in warehouses, regardless of whether Christmas was strong or weak, regardless of whether the economy boomed or crashed. The payments were contractual obligations, as fixed as gravity. When the Kenner Parker deal closed, debt consumed 86% of Tonka's total capital. The company that 3 men had started in a schoolhouse with their pooled savings, the company built on steel trucks and quality, and the promise of durability, now owed more money than it had ever earned in any single year of its existence. Business Week had asked the question before the deal even closed. An October 1987 cover story carried the headline, "Is Tonka Toying with Trouble?" The answer was already forming. Despite rising operating income, Tonka lost money in 1988. The business itself was generating cash. The toys sold. The operations ran. The newly combined company, Tonka plus Kenner Parker, Mighty Dump plus Monopoly, Steel Trucks plus Play-Doh, produced revenue that would have seemed miraculous a decade earlier. None of it mattered. The interest payments consumed everything. Every efficiency gain Schenck's team extracted from the merged operations. Every successful product launch. Every cost reduction. Every headcount cut. Every penny squeezed from the supply chain. The junk bonds ate it all. The interest payments totaled approximately $50 million per year. $50 million. Every year. Due on schedule regardless of performance, regardless of market conditions, regardless of anything except the calendar and the contracts. The acquisition that was supposed to save the company was bleeding it dry from the inside. Ghostbusters had been one of the crown jewels of Kenner Parker, a toy line tied to one of the biggest movie franchises of the 1980s. But Ghostbusters 2, released in 1989, underperformed expectations. The toy sales that were supposed to follow underperformed with it. Meanwhile, a new phenomenon was devouring the action figure market. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, 4 mutated turtles named after Renaissance artists, fighting crime from a sewer, had become the obsession of every child in America. The toys were everywhere. The cartoon was on every afternoon. The movie was coming. Tonka didn't have the license. Someone else had made that deal. The hottest property in the toy industry belonged to competitors, and Tonka was left trying to sell yesterday's franchises against tomorrow's phenomenon. Revenue stagnated, costs were fixed, debt payments were relentless. By 1990, Tonka was negotiating covenant waivers with its banks. Covenant waivers. The term is technical, but the meaning is simple. Begging. When a company borrows money, the loan agreements include covenants, promises about financial performance, about maintaining certain ratios, about meeting certain thresholds. When a company can't meet those covenants, the lenders have the right to call in the loans, to force repayment, to push the company into bankruptcy. Tonka couldn't meet its covenants. The executives flew to Chicago to meet with the bankers. The conversations were about survival, about buying time, about restructuring terms, about anything that would keep the company alive long enough for something to change. The company posted a $10.3 million loss for 1990. The stock, which had traded much higher during the brief boom of GoBots and Pound Puppies, collapsed to $4.50 per share. Dick Youngblood, a columnist for the Minneapolis Star-Tribune who had covered Minnesota business for years, wrote a line that became famous in local circles. It captured everything. The acquisition means that Tonka's most famous product, the truck that can last a generation, has proved more durable than its maker. The truck outlasts the company. The 11 pounds of yellow steel survives longer than the institution that created it. Forbes magazine ran a story in January 1991. The headline, Trouble in Toyland. Both Hasbro and Mattel began circling. The two giants of the American toy industry recognized what Tonka had become, a distressed asset, a fire sale waiting to happen, a collection of valuable brands attached to a dying balance sheet. On January 31st, 1991, Hasbro Inc. and Tonka Corporation announced a merger agreement. Both companies had bid. Both had offered the same price per share. The difference was structure. Hasbro offered all cash. Mattel offered half cash, half stock. When a company is drowning, cash is oxygen. Mattel's stock might appreciate over time. Cash was worth something certain, something immediate, something the banks and the bondholders would accept. Cash won. The architects of the deal on the Hasbro side were Alan Hassenfeld, the chairman and CEO, and Barry Alperin, the vice chairman. Tom Dusenberry, a former Parker Brothers executive who had watched his company get absorbed into Kenner Parker and now watched it get absorbed again, remembered their entrance at the announcement. In walked Alan Hassenfeld and Barry Alperin, the mastermind and the brains behind the biggest acquisition in toy industry history. On the Tonka side, Stephen Shank signed the papers. BG. French, the company spokeswoman, handled communications with the press. The board had formally approved the terms on April 18th and 19th, 1991. There was nothing left to do but close. The deal completed on May 7th, 1991. Total value, approximately $486 million, $7 per share for the common stock, about $107 million for the 15.3 million shares outstanding. Buyback of $322 million in junk bonds at 75 to 80 cents on the dollar. Even the bondholders took a haircut. Assumption of $111 million in senior bank debt. Do the math, and the irony becomes unbearable. Hasbro paid less for all of Tonka, including every asset Stephen Shank had borrowed money to acquire, including Kenner Parker, including Monopoly and Play-Doh and Nerf and Ghostbusters and everything else, than Tonka had paid for Kenner Parker alone 4 years earlier. The $555 million acquisition had destroyed the company that made it. Hasbro bought the wreckage at a discount. Hasbro promised that Tonka's production facilities would not be affected. Alan Hassenfeld said publicly that he would endeavor to minimize the adverse effects on employees. The press releases were carefully worded, professionally optimistic. 6 days later, on May 13th, 1991, Alfred Verrecchia announced the closure of Tonka's Minnesota corporate headquarters. Verrecchia was Hasbro's head of domestic toy operations. His statement was a single sentence dressed in corporate euphemism. With Tonka's financial difficulties, we had to balance the need to reduce expenses and yet maintain the creative spirit within the overall organization. 242 employees. marketing, design, finance, administration, human resources. The white-collar workers who had kept the company running from the Minnetonka office complex, while the factory jobs moved to Mexico and the ownership moved to Rhode Island, terminated effective December 31st, 1991. Some received offers to relocate to Hasbro's headquarters in Pawtucket. Some received severance packages and job hunting assistance. All of them received the news that Tonka, as a Minnesota company, as a thing rooted in the state where it had been born, was over. Stephen Shank walked away. He founded Capella Education Company later that year, initially called the Graduate School of America, an early entrant in the online education market. The company went public in 2006. In 2018, Capella merged with Strayer Education in a deal valued at $1.9 billion. The man who closed the Mound factory, who loaded the balance sheet with junk bonds, who sold what remained to Hasbro, became an education entrepreneur worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He was twice named to Inc. magazine's Entrepreneur Hall of Fame. The workers in Mound didn't have Harvard law degrees. They didn't have exit packages or equity stakes or the connections to start billion-dollar companies. They had skills that only mattered if someone needed a steel truck stamped and painted and assembled by hand. Nobody needed that anymore. The shift from steel to plastic didn't happen on a single day. It accumulated across decades, one decision at a time, until the trucks that emerged from Chinese factories shared nothing with the trucks that had rolled off the Mound line except the name. Plastic wheels replaced rubber tires in the early 1960s, a minor change, barely noticeable, justified by cost savings that seemed trivial. Cheaper plastic truck lines appeared alongside the steel models in the 1970s, budget options for parents who couldn't afford the mighty dump. Under Stephen Shank, before the Kenner Parker acquisition, before everything collapsed, plastic had become what one collector called a big component of even the flagship products. The trucks still looked like Tonkas. They didn't feel like Tonkas anymore. Under Hasbro, the transition accelerated toward its logical conclusion. Plastic was lighter. Plastic was cheaper. Plastic could be molded in shapes that steel couldn't match. Plastic could be manufactured overseas for a fraction of the cost, in factories where labor regulations were minimal and environmental concerns were someone else's problem. In 1993, Tonka lost its position as the #1 toy truck brand in America. The company that took the title was SLM International, maker of Buddy L. Their trucks had battery-operated lights and sound effects, electronic gimmicks that steel couldn't accommodate, features that felt modern in ways that yellow-painted metal didn't. The market had voted. Durability lost. Features won. In 1998, Hasbro licensed the Tonka brand to Funrise Toy Corporation, a Van Nuys company that was itself a subsidiary of Hong Kong-based Matrix Holdings. Production moved to China. The trucks that Alvin Tesh had redesigned in 20-gauge automotive steel, the same grade they stamped into Chevrolets and Fords, were now injection molded from petroleum-based polymers in factories in Shenzhen by workers who had never heard of Mound, Minnesota, who had never seen Lake Minnetonka, who had no idea that the brand name on the toys they assembled came from a Dakota Sioux word meaning great. At peak production, the Mound plant had consumed 5 to 6 million pounds of steel annually for the mighty dump alone. Another 15 to 17 million pounds fed the rest of the line. The Chinese factories used no steel at all. The original plant still stands on Shoreline Road, visible from the lake if you know where to look. Rasco Industries occupies 50,000 square feet of the former Tonka factory now. They manufacture doors and screens, useful products, unremarkable products, products that have nothing to do with toy trucks. Other tenants fill other portions of the complex. The building that once stretched a third of a mile along the lakeshore has been subdivided, repurposed, scrubbed of any visible connection to its past. The Minnesota Pollution Control Agency tracks the site under a clinical designation, Tonka Main Plant, EPA identification number MND 0062-47159, a Superfund adjacent notation in a government database. The trichloroethylene that workers had used as a degreasing solvent from 1954 to 1982, that sharp chlorinated smell that was simply part of the job, part of the sensory landscape of making things, has been migrating through the groundwater ever since. The contamination plume threatens Harrison Bay on Lake Minnetonka. The lake gave the company its name. The name came from a Dakota word meaning great. The company poisoned the lake in return. That's the legacy that lingers longest, seeping through the soil while the buildings above change hands and change purposes and forget. Mound itself survived. The town was close enough to the Twin Cities that residents could find other work, other purposes, other reasons to stay. The population grew modestly, from roughly 7,500 in 1970 to 9,398 by 2020, though it has been slowly declining since. The median household income is $91,370. The poverty rate is 4%. Manufacturing remains the largest employment sector, with 937 jobs as of 2023. No single employer approaches Tonka's scale. Nothing fills the space that Tonka occupied, not economically, not socially, not in the identity of a place that once called itself the trucking capital of the world. The Westonka Historical Society operates the Tonka Toy Museum on the top floor of Mound City Hall. The building sits within sight of the factory where the toys were made, close enough to walk if you don't mind the weather. The museum opened June 15, 2013, 30 years after the last truck rolled off the Mound production line. Over 400 Tonka products fill the display cases, many still in original packaging. Company newsletters line the shelves, annual reports from the boom years, catalogs showing products that haven't been manufactured in decades, photographs of workers on the assembly line, their faces clear but their names mostly forgotten, captured in a moment that passed before anyone understood it was worth preserving. Lloyd Lauman was the museum's largest donor. He gave more than 300 toys from his personal collection of 500, nearly everything he had accumulated over a lifetime of work. The man who started packaging toys in 1955, who rose to vice president of manufacturing, who walked through the plant, writing goodbyes in his head, spent his final years making sure someone would remember. He died on November 22, 2015, at 78 years old. Ron Pauley, the model maker who had helped design the Mighty Dump, loaned more than 200 toys. Vern Brandenburg and Mary Opheim, both former employees, volunteer as tour guides now. They walk visitors through the collection, answer questions about what the work was like, point to specific trucks and explain which years they came from, which production runs, which small variations mark one era from another. The museum charges a suggested $3 donation. It hosts reunions for Tonka employees, the ones still living, the ones healthy enough to make the drive, the ones who want to stand together in a room full of yellow trucks and remember. In December 2024, a collector named Micah James donated an original oval Tonka Toys sign to the museum. James owns more than 4,000 Tonka trucks, one of the largest private collections in the country. He studies the variations obsessively, the different wheel types, the changed decals, the small manufacturing differences that reveal when and where a particular truck was made. He made an observation when he handed over the sign. When the Mound factory closed, it seems they threw almost everything away. Threw it away. The progressive dies that had cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to engineer. The tooling, the prototypes, the photographs and production records, the institutional memory of how to build something that was designed to last. Someone decided it had no value. It went into dumpsters and scrap heaps and landfills, and it was gone. The knowledge scattered. The expertise died with the workers who held it. What survives is what individuals saved on their own. The toys Lloyd Lauman kept in his basement. The prototypes Ron Pauley rescued. The scraps and fragments that collectors piece together like archaeologists. The collector market has assigned value where the company didn't. Vintage steel Tonkas sell for $50 to $150 in good condition now. Rare specimens with original boxes bring $300, $500, sometimes more. Private label trucks from the 1950s and 1960s, Robin Hood Flour, Standard Oil, Allied van lines, command $1,000 or more from serious collectors. A Tonka jet delivery truck sold for $1,350 on eBay. The toys outlast everything. They outlast the workers who built them. They outlast the executives who manage them. They outlast the company that designed them and the corporate successors who discarded the knowledge of how they were made. Hasbro still owns the Tonka intellectual property. The brand name, the trademarks, the right to put Tonka on a toy truck, all of it sits in a portfolio in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, alongside Monopoly and Play-Doh and G.I. Joe and everything else. Since 2019, the manufacturing license has belonged to Basic Fun, a company based in Boca Raton, Florida. They sell a Steel Classics line, trucks with cold-rolled steel bodies and plastic wheels, a deliberate heritage play marketed to nostalgic parents who remember what Tonka used to mean. Shaquille O'Neal appears in the commercials, lending celebrity weight to a brand that once needed no endorsement beyond its own reputation. The flagship Steel Classics Mighty Dump retails for $30 to $50. Basic Fun. Filed Chapter 11. Bankruptcy on June 28, 2024. The press release cited the familiar cascade that has devastated American toy companies. Toys R Us collapsing, trade wars with China, COVID supply chain chaos, consumer spending pullbacks. The company that licensed the right to build Tonka trucks couldn't make the economics work. The city of Mound is trying to preserve what remains. A project called Lost Lake Commons, approved in July 2025 at an estimated cost of $800,000, will include what the City Council called historical nods to the Tonka Toys legacy through proposed walkways and signage. The 2026 municipal priorities include exploring a licensing opportunity to display Tonka trucks in a city park, walkways, signage, a display in a park. Pam Myers, president of the Westonka Historical Society, explained the museum's purpose in an interview. Remember the three guys who started Apple in the garage. This is three guys who started Tonka Toy Company in an old school building. 3 men. A 4-room schoolhouse on Linwood Boulevard. A pile of wooden prototypes that someone else had given up on. The insight that steel changes everything. They built something that 90% of American households owned. They built trucks that could survive an elephant standing on them, that could outlast a childhood, that could be handed down from older siblings to younger ones and still work decades later. They employed 2,000 people in a town of 8,000. They hosted Christmas parties where every worker's child received a gift chosen just for them. They erected signs at the edge of town, "Welcome to the trucking capital of the world," and meant every word. Then the decisions accumulated, one after another, each one defensible in isolation, each one leading to the next. The factory closed because the spreadsheets said it should. The acquisitions piled up because scale was supposed to matter. The debt mounted because borrowing was cheaper than waiting. The headquarters moved because efficiency demanded it. The steel became plastic because plastic was cheaper. The plastic moved to China because labor was cheaper still. What remains are the trucks. They're in attics and basements and collectors' shelves now, in museums within sight of the factory where they were made. Some are 60 years old, older than most of the careers of the people who assembled them. The yellow paint has faded to something softer. The decals have worn at the edges. The rubber tires, the ones that were rubber before they became plastic, have cracked and dried with age, but pick one up and it's still heavy, still solid, still dense with the weight of steel stamped and bent and painted by hands that knew what they were doing. A toy shouldn't break just because a child plays with it. That was the promise. The promise that justified the price, that earned the loyalty, that built a company in a town and a generation of memories. The trucks kept it. The company couldn't say the same.